December of 1940 was an unusually cold month in the town of Windham, Ohio, home to 316 people and a graduating class of 13 seniors at Windham High School. But one single line in a famous magazine made this little village the toast of the American sports world, because American Boy magazine had declared Windham the international champions of the booming sport of six-man football. There was no team in North America better than the Windham Bombers. They had spent the preceding 2 seasons demolishing teams in Portage County, with many of their games called at halftime because Windham was leading by more than 45 points. 3 of the players on that 1940 team, senior Fred Stanley and juniors Harold Stanley and Bob Turner, had been named first-team All-Americans. Coach Dean Eberwine would lose only 2 players, Fred Stanley and backup center Robert Fector, from that squad. And he would have to replace his manager, skinny Robert Pavlik, whom he had once substituted into a game in an attempt to keep the score down. And before I go any further, could you go over and through the bottom left hand, I think it's the bottom left hand, top left hand thing, and then just a little bit to the left. It says Mike. Check, 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 check. You still getting something out of there? Are you still getting something out of it? Great. Okay. I don't want people to run out of here screaming. And I have at least one person in this audience that has tinnitus, and I'll hear about it if his ears start howling because of me. So. Okay. There was no reason to believe in the fall of 1940 that the dynasty would come to an end. Eberwine spent the off-season dreaming of a way to equal his audacity at scheduling a game against the Canadian six-man champions in the fall of 1940, and then destroying them by the score of 39-1. Yes, indeed, it looked like Windham would be an indelible fixture on the sports pages for years to come. But world history has a strange way of changing things, even in a town as remote as Windham, Ohio. In 1940, Windham was a 25-square-mile township, shaped exactly the same as every other township in the Western Reserve, with a small crossroads village sitting at its center. Now, using today's road names, the entire village consisted basically of East and West Center Streets from traffic light to traffic light, and North Main Street to its one northern traffic light. But South Main Street, which today ends forlornly at a gate on the other side of the railroad tracks, had a busy commercial center on both sides of the tracks, grocery stores, a post office, and Paul's lumber mill. And for 2.5 miles further south were the richest farmlands and some of the oldest families in Windham Township, until August 1940. Because World War II had begun in Europe, and the United States government, knowing full well that America would inevitably be drawn into it, had seized all the land south of the railroad tracks for one of the largest munition plants in all of the country. Every person living on that land was evicted, often given less than a week to abandon their family's lands, auction off their goods, and find a home elsewhere. By August 31st, the largest mass relocation in the history of the state of Ohio was over. The entire month of August, as Superintendent Eberwine prepared for the opening of schools, he had to share the high school with government engineers and surveyors, who had commandeered classrooms to make preparations for September 1st, the first day they could legally enter the seized lands. The Ravenna Army ammunition plant, known locally as the Ravenna Arsenal, became the monster that devoured Windham. Coach Everwine took his 1940 Bombers to the top of the football world in the shadow of that colossus, and the bucolic little village would never, ever be the same. On August 18, 1941, exactly 3 weeks before Coach Dean Everwine gathered his Windham Bombers to prepare for the defense of their Portage County League Championship, the first loaded artillery shells rolled off the assembly line of the arsenal. Those bombs would continue to roll in ever-increasing numbers for the next 6 years. No one knew at the time that those assembly lines would one day spell the end of six-man football in Windham. Superintendent Dean Everwine had spent a hectic year keeping up with the drama of having students who had spent their entire lives in the Windham schools disappearing off the enrollment lists overnight. Coach Dean Everwine, however, was able to relax because none of his returning lettermen lived south of the tracks. On September 10, 1941, the Bombers dedicated their new football field, with one end abutting what is now Bauer Avenue, and the other end extending all the way to Charlie Curtis's cow barn, only a drop kick away from the fence that now cut Windham in half. At the dedication, Everwine was presented with a bronze plaque honoring Windham's international victory over Stamford Collegiate of Niagara Falls, Canada. And he announced to the crowd the next hurdle he had placed for his team. They were going to travel to Clyde, Ohio, in the middle of the season to settle once and for all exactly who was the best football team in Ohio. Clyde, it seemed, was in a snit over American boy choosing Windham over them as the 1940 champion, and Everwine wanted to settle it on the field. As Everwine spoke at that dedication ceremony, the ground under his feet trembled from bomb testing at the arsenal. Some folks took that as an omen. The Bombers returned an imposing lineup that year with All-Americans Harold Stanley at halfback and Bob Turner at fullback. Joe Kinney was now settled in at quarterback, taking the snap and then flipping either to Stanley for an end run or to Turner for a pass. At the end slots were speedy Frank Janicek and tiny Bob Goss. At center was veteran Harold Belden, who had fallen in love with a new classmate named Mary Ammons, whose footloose father, my grandfather, had moved the family from Fort Wayne, Indiana to seek work as a telephone lineman in the arsenal. The second string backfield that year would have been starting on any other team in the county: Conrad Thrasher, Art Joy, and Don Miller. The rookies on the team that year were Paul Turner, Tom Wedding, Dick Haney, Glenn Ball, Melvin Brandenburg, and Ellis Mulholland. In the first half of the first game that year, against the Shalersville Rams, every single one of those boys saw action. The Bombers scored 44 points in the first half, 1 point short of the 45-point mercy rule. And just after halftime, Bob Turner scored his third touchdown to make the final score 52-6 after 21 minutes of play. The Bombers were as strong as they had ever been, and everybody in the county knew it. Manaway Township arrived the next week and went home bruised and battered at the short end of a 38-0 score, in a game in which Joe Kinney demonstrated his mastery of the long-lost art of the drop kick, booting 3 extra points which counted for 2 points apiece. 2 games into the season, and the Ravenna Record newspaper was already predicting a Northern Division championship for the Bombers, and salivating over a showdown with the likely Southern Division champions, the Charlestown Wildcats. Except no one had consulted with the Hiram High School Huskies, one of the county's perennial sad sack teams. After all, Windham had dismissed them 40-12 the previous fall. Both teams entered the third game of the season having given up just 1 touchdown in 2 games. But the game opened on an ominous note as the stout Hiram defense tackled Harold Stanley in the end zone for the first safety that Windham High School had ever given up.